What if the United States decided to conquer the whole world? Who could actually stop it, and where? On paper, the US is still the most powerful military force on Earth. According to 2026 military rankings, it holds the top position with the strongest overall power index, and spends between $900 billion and nearly $1 trillion per year on defense. That's about 37% of total global military spending. No other country comes even close. Yes, China is rising, Russia is already in a wartime mode, and India is growing fast, but none of them match the United States in combined global reach, logistics, air power, naval strength, and the number of forces and bases it has around the world. And that positioning matters. The US has around 750 to 800 military bases spread across about 80 countries. Japan, Germany, and South Korea alone host more than 100,000 American troops. Other major hubs are Guam, Italy, Bahrain, even though that's now with a question mark, and the UK. This isn't just about defense. It's a ready-made global strike network. If Washington wanted to move fast, it wouldn't need to send forces overseas. They're already there. And as we've seen in recent conflicts, US strategy today isn't about long occupations. That's why the idea of conquering the world looks very different and far more complicated than it sounds at first. Nuclear shield. The new START treaty expired in February 2026, and that quietly changed the nuclear balance. For the first time in decades, the US and Russia are no longer limited by agreed upon maximum numbers of deployed nuclear warheads. The US still maintains a full nuclear triad: land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines carrying ballistic missiles, long-range strategic bombers. On top of that, new systems are coming online. The B-21 Raider stealth bomber will soon be in service, a next-generation aircraft designed to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, carry nuclear or conventional weapons, and strike targets anywhere in the world without being detected. At sea, Columbia-class submarines are set to replace older boats, built to stay hidden for decades at a time. But in this scenario, nukes are mainly about keeping others out. The threat alone creates leverage. For a global campaign like this, information becomes an even bigger advantage. The US Space Force focuses on controlling satellites, communications, and navigation, what it calls space superiority. Systems like Starshield give the US secure links for military communications, missile warning, and real-time tracking almost anywhere on Earth. Control space, and nothing happens without you seeing it first. And knocking satellites out isn't the silver bullet it used to be. With modern rockets from companies like SpaceX, the US can put new satellites into orbit fast. And then there's another powerful weapon: money. The US dollar still runs the global economy. About half of the world's reserves are held in dollars, and most international trade uses it in some way. Even when two countries trade with each other, the payment often passes through US-controlled systems. That gives Washington huge leverage. Because the US controls key financial networks, it can cut countries off from global banking. When that happens, banks freeze, imports stop, foreign reserves become unusable, and the local currency can crash in days. For most countries, that's an economic nightmare. New rules introduced in 2025 made this pressure even stronger. Digital dollars can now move globally without relying on local banks, which means US financial influence can reach companies and people directly, not just governments. Add a strategic stockpile of gold and even Bitcoin as a backup, and the US protects itself even if some countries try to move away from the dollar, which on its own would be a long and difficult process. The result is simple: the US wouldn't need to invade every single country, because cutting off money, trade, and payments can force compliance on its own. But obviously, there's a limit to this. Economic pressure can break governments, but it can't physically control territory. And that's where the idea of conquering the world starts to fall apart. Occupation problem. If the US tried to physically occupy huge countries like China, India, or Russia, it would hit a hard limit very fast. There's a basic rule used by military planners called the Quinlivan ratio. In simple terms, it says you need about 20 soldiers for every 1,000 civilians just to keep an occupied population stable and under control. With about 8 billion people on Earth, that would mean 160 60 million troops. The US military has about 1.3 million active duty personnel. So even on paper, full global occupation isn't realistic. Just occupying China alone would require tens of millions of troops. That's not something any modern military can pull off. Even in smaller countries, history shows that much weaker groups can slowly wear down far stronger armies. Sure, air power, satellites, and surveillance help, but they can't eliminate resistance or stop guerrilla warfare. The Pentagon knows this. That's why it's pushing projects like Replicator, which aims to use large numbers of cheap autonomous drones to reduce the need for soldiers on the ground. But as of now, that program is still behind schedule and struggling with coordination and scale. So full military occupation of the world is impossible. But political control is a different story, and that's where things get even more complicated. Counter forces. The core of that pushback would almost certainly be China and Russia. As of now, the two are already coordinating far more closely than before, sharing intelligence, working together on energy routes, drone production, and building alternatives to Western financial systems. They don't need to fully trust each other, they just need a shared interest in limiting US power. China controls large parts of the global supply chain for critical minerals and manufacturing. Russia, despite being weakened by war and sanctions, still has energy leverage and the ability to stir trouble in Europe and possibly Middle East. Together, they can make large US expansion far more costly. We're already seeing a version of this in the Middle East right now. Big powers avoiding fighting each other directly and instead push back indirectly, even when their allies are under attack, at least for now. Instead of fighting the US head-on, rivals focus on making access dangerous and expensive. China's anti-ship missiles are designed to threaten aircraft carriers. Drones and precision missiles make bases harder to defend. And countries like China, and until recently Iran, have been able to produce cheap drones at scale, although in Iran's case, that capability is now in question. Then there's BRICS Plus, a loose group that now includes countries like Saudi Arabia and even Iran. They don't act as one unified alliance, but they do offer alternatives to US-led world order when it comes to trade, energy, and finance. Another key question is how US allies and countries closely tied to American economy would react. Would they simply go along with it, try to negotiate closer cooperation, or decide to side with the opposition instead? The key point is this: none of these groups need to beat the US militarily. They only need to raise the cost high enough that expansion no longer makes sense, financially and especially in terms of casualties. And that leads to the biggest limitation of all: the United States itself. Internal limits. By 2025, US national debt hit around $37 trillion, more than 120% of GDP. Fewer foreign investors are buying that debt. Interest payments keep climbing. Mortgage rates have been near 8%, and inflation recently peaked around 9%. A long global military campaign would put even more strain on that system. If investors lose confidence, borrowing gets more expensive fast. At that point, the government faces a hard choice: protect the economy at home or keep expanding militarily abroad. Then there's manpower. Only about 23% of young Americans currently meet the basic standards to serve in the military. The number of 18-year-olds is shrinking, and fewer people say they even want to serve. Those trends are moving in the wrong direction. A serious attempt at global conquest would almost certainly require a draft. And a draft, in today's political climate, would likely spark major protests and unrest. History shows that internal instability is far more dangerous than any foreign enemy. Once things start breaking down at home, no amount of military power abroad can make up for it. So could the US conquer the world? Actually occupying the whole world? No. There simply aren't enough troops for that. But forcing many countries to fall in line without occupation is much more realistic. By controlling space, cyber networks, global finance, and using nuclear deterrence, the US could pressure governments without sending in large armies. Power wouldn't come from taking territory, but from the ability to disrupt economies, communications, and security. The real limit isn't military strength, it's sustainability. Trying to pressure too many countries at once would strain the economy, cause unrest at home, and push rivals to band together. If you want to see what would happen if red states fought blue states, check out the video on your screen. Thanks for watching.